Hey folks, we're almost here at the end of school, and we have about 2 weeks left, 2.5, before all's said and done. I think it's the 24th now, and um, we're done on the 11th, I believe. So it's, I guess, 3 weeks if you include this week with that. So 6 classes between now and the end of the year, and that's obviously not enough. There's a lot of things that we would still do in ninth grade English that we just haven't had time to do because of COVID, because of the restructuring of the classroom and all of that. And so normally we'd teach Shakespeare's Romeo and Juliet. Obviously, I don't have time to do that. Normally, I'd do a lesson on sonnets to help introduce Shakespearean language and there's that. And then usually I end with a lesson on poetry, and even that is going to be truncated. But that's what I'm going to do. I'm going to start out with a little bit of a lesson on poetry. I'll try and get you a poem a day, maybe occasionally two poems in a day between here and the end of the year. And I think the good place to start is just with a Victorian poem. I've got one here by a guy named Thomas Hardy. And, you know, normally what happens in English classes, and one of the reasons so many of my students don't like poetry coming into my class, is because we ask them to read things that are above their level. And we ask them to somehow magically understand them. And then we act as if there's only one accurate interpretation of a poem, as if a poem isn't a relationship between the poet and the reader. And what the reader gets out of it has value, even if it isn't what the textbook says at the back of the book as to what the poem means. Poems were never written to be analyzed in textbooks. They were written to be in a relationship between the poet and the reader, and to be understood that way. And so we often tell you what's right and wrong as teachers, and I think that's unfortunate. That's not to say there aren't wrong interpretations. Like what I always say in English class, and I want to reinforce this again, is I guess there aren't right and wrongs in English class. They're just well argued and badly argued. If you can't find evidence to support your interpretation, if you can't back it up with analysis of what the poet wrote, then you don't have a leg to stand on in your argument. And then technically, I guess it's wrong. If you can support it, if you can back it up, if you can make clear analytical points, then it's not wrong. It might be different, but it's not wrong. So normally this is what happens. A teacher assigns a poem. They say, hey, go read The Shadow on the Stone by Thomas Hardy. And then they have a class discussion about it in which they try and tell you what the poem means and express the meaning of the poem to you in sort of a didactic way. And I don't know that that's the most effective means of understanding a poem. For example, let's say I assign you this poem. Go read The Shadow on the Stone by Thomas Hardy. In fact, you could pause this and go read it right now. But failing that, let me read it out loud, just once to you. The Shadow on the Stone by Thomas Hardy. I went by the druid stone that broods in the garden white and lone, and I stopped and looked at the shifting shadows that at some moments fall thereon. From the tree hard by with a rhythmic swing, and they shaped in my imagining to the shade that a well-known head and shoulders threw there when she was gardening. I thought her behind my back, yeah, her I long had learned to lack, and I said, I am sure you are standing behind me, though how do you get into this old track? And there was no sound but the fall of a leaf, as a sad response, and to keep down the grief, I would not turn my head to discover that there was nothing in my belief. Yet I wanted to look and see that nobody stood at the back of me, but I thought once more, nay, I'll not unvision a shape which somehow there may be. So I went on softly from the glade, and left her behind me throwing her shade. As she were indeed an apparition, my head unturned lest my dream should fade. What'd you get from that? Maybe the general situation. Maybe you understand that there's a narrator who's an I, and he's walking in a garden, and he hears something, and he thinks it sounds like someone, but he doesn't dare look back because he's afraid she might not be there. I guess, like, if you got that, then great. You're doing pretty well. You're understanding a complex poem on a surface level and literally what's happening. But this is the problem. We assign you to read it, you go read it, and you say, I've read it. Did you understand it, though? If you read a poem once, it's like listening to a song once. You don't get the song after one listen. How many times have you listened to a song on an album and it's the 15th, the 17th, the 24th, the 116th time that you listen to it that it really starts clicking with you, that you really feel like you start to understand it and emotionally connect with it? Well, that's how poems are. They're not meant to be read once. They're meant to be read a lot of times. And they're not just meant to be read, they're meant to be heard. So when you're reading it on the page, you're not getting the sound effects that the poet intended for you. So you really need to hear them. And when you hear them with inflection in the voice, because poetry is a vocal art. The first form of poetry was what was called lyric poetry. It was poetry that was accompanied by a musical instrument called the lyre. It goes back to a guy named Orpheus, who is a famous Greek that we learned about in the mythology unit. So, and that may be why I picked this poem. Hold your thought. So, I would ask you to read it again, but I would ask you to do some work with it when you read it again. So pause, record skipping sound. Let's take a look at some poetry terms that will help us understand the poem. Literary terms, poetry, English 9. So we'll do this and we'll do it hopefully relatively quickly. There's a lot to learn. Let me slide this over just a little bit more. I don't want my picture to cover up terms for you. There's a lot to learn about poetry, and I tried to condense some of the more important stuff down into a terms list here for you that I'll attach to the lesson. So the first thing you need to know about poetry is, at least for our purposes, one of the ways to identify poetry is that it rhymes. It has what's called end rhyme. We're looking at the words at the ends of lines and trying to find a pattern in the rhyming of them. That's one quick way to identify poetry. Does all poetry rhyme? No. I will show you a poem that does not rhyme in this unit, just to make your lives complicated. But in ninth grade, in early high school, most of the poetry that you're going to see rhymes. And the poetry that you listen to on the radio most definitely rhymes. In fact, it's one of the chief elements of lyric poetry, and all of the songs on the radio are lyric poetry. Lyric poetry is alive and well. People love to say that poetry is dead. It's not. We love it still. We just listen to it with music, and reading poetry on the page sometimes feels dead, but there's plenty of us nerds, like me included, who still read poetry for the pure enjoyment of it and write it sometimes. Anyway, end rhyme. It's when words at the ends of line rhyme with each other in a repeating pattern. That's the key, the repeating pattern. So when you look at a poem, you want to say, hey, is there a repeating pattern of rhyme? Was there? Uh-oh, I just closed it. Let's bring it back. Stone, lone, shadows thereon, swing, imagining, shoulders, gardening. Okay, yeah, stone and lone rhyme. I think that they're trying to make swing, imagining, and gardening rhyme. So yeah, there's some rhyming in there, sure. And then your next stanza, back and lack, those rhyme. And track rhymes with those. Me and leaf, that doesn't really rhyme, but leaf and grief does. And belief, so we got some rhymes in there. Clearly, it's a rhyming poem, and that should be an indication to you. So, what you have to do, though, to identify what's going on is to identify what's called the rhyme scheme. That's the pattern of rhyme in a poem. So there's a number of different and famous types of rhyme schemes, and I just want to go over a few of them. The most basic rhyme scheme, the easiest rhyme scheme to find in English, is called a couplet. It's what you see in Dr. Seuss and on greeting cards and things like that. So, I do not like green eggs and ham. I do not like them, Sam I am. See that? Ham and am rhyme. It's AA. But it's in music too. So, if you pop The Devil Went Down to Georgia into your, or if you hit the button and play it on your YouTube or whatever, I could play it now, but I don't want to get in copyright trouble. The Devil Went Down to Georgia by Charlie Daniels. Johnny, rosin up your bow and play your fiddle hard, because hell's broke loose in Georgia and the devil deals the cards. And if you win, you get this shiny fiddle made of gold, but if you lose, the devil gets your soul. Right, look at that. Hard, cards, gold, soul. Sure, that's couplets. It keeps going. The devil opened up his case and he said, I'll start this show. And fire flew from his fingertips as he rosined up his bow, and he pulled the bow across the strings, and it made an evil hiss. And a band of demons joined in, and it sounded something like this. Look at that. Show, bow, hiss, this. That's easy to see. It's couplets from beginning to end. Good stuff. Quatrains are a little more complicated. Now, couplets, by the way, it's a couple. Easy way to identify is it's like a pair of lines that are dating each other. It's like when you go to the mall and you see a couple and they're both wearing Cowboys jerseys, and you're like, whoa! No offense to Cowboys fans, but that's a couple. You can tell they're together. Quatrains get a little bit more complicated. Quatrain has the root word of quat, which you see in quarter, and the quad, if you go to a college campus. So it's four, right? So it's 4 lines that share a rhyme scheme. Now there's lots of different rhyme combinations for quatrains. ABAB or ABCB or ABBA. There's all kinds of different ways to identify these things. Oh, let's talk about rhyme scheme for just a second. How do I identify the rhyme scheme? Well, we're looking at end rhymes. So the ending word of the first line is always A. Anything in the rest of the poem that rhymes with it is also going to be A. So lamb. But then our second line ends with snow. That doesn't rhyme with lamb, so we've got to make it B. Then we look at went. It doesn't rhyme with snow or lamb, so we make it C. But go definitely rhymes with snow, so it's a B. So like you go through your poem and you're going to identify which ends rhyme with which, and that's going to create your rhyme scheme. So Mary Had Little Lamb is a quatrain poem. Mary had little lamb, its fleece was white as snow, and everywhere that Mary went, the lamb was sure to go. Snow and go rhyme, lamb and went don't. So lamb is your first one, it's an A. B, snow. Went, it doesn't rhyme with anything, it's a C. Go is B. Another great example is Billy Joel's Piano Man. We're going to go with musical examples, we might as well. It's 9 o'clock on a Saturday. The regular crowd shuffles in. There's an old man sitting next to me, making love to his tonic and gin. Right? So Saturday is your first one. It's an A. Anything that rhymes with Saturday is also going to be an A. In doesn't, so that's a B. Me does not rhyme with either Saturday or in, so it becomes a C. And then gin definitely rhymes with in, so that's a B. And that's how we identify the rhyme scheme. That one's in quatrains. There's lots of things out there that are quatrains, very, very popular for songs and poems too. You know, like off the top of my head, water, water everywhere, and all the boards did shrink. Water, water everywhere, and not a drop to drink. That's from the Rhyme of the Ancient Mariner. That's a quatrain. You know, I can probably come up with other ones if you really want me to. Sestet, we're getting a little more complicated. A sestet is 6 lines that share a rhyme scheme. There's lots of different ways to do it. This first one's AAA, BBB. Second one's ABBA, CC. Another one would be AB, or ABC, ABC. There's the more lines you have, the more combinations there can be. But you want to look at the stanza length. A stanza is essentially to a poem what a paragraph is to a page. So you'll find that poems are, hey, let's go back to Hardy. Poems are broken into stanzas. See how we have this? This is the first stanza. This space there, it's spaced out. It's like the paragraph break down here at the bottom. And then we got a second stanza. And then we got a third stanza. And generally, when you have multiple stanzas, the stanzas are all going to be in the same rhyme scheme. So if we can identify the rhyme scheme for the first one, it will almost be a mirror image of that in the second one and the third one. We'll see if that holds true with this poem when we go and do the rhyme scheme. Whoops. Let's keep going. So here's a famous poem, a Victorian poem by a guy named Alfred Lord Tennyson. It's called The Eagle. It's a good example of a sestet poem. He clasps the crag with crooked hands, close to the sun in lonely lands. Ringed with the azure world he stands. The wrinkled sea beneath him crawls. He watches from his mountain walls, and like a thunderbolt, he falls. There's some nice Zeus in that eagle. I love it. And there's a simile there at the end. But yeah, it's hands, land, stands, crawls, walls, falls. It's AAA, BBB. And then a famous song that has a sestet rhyme scheme would be Hotel California by the Eagles. Welcome to the Hotel California, such a lovely place. Hold on, somebody's outside my door. Sorry. That was my son asking me a question. So, Hotel California by the Eagles. Welcome to the Hotel California. Such a lovely place. And then the repetition. Such a lovely place. Such a lovely face. Plenty of room at the Hotel California. Any time of year. Any time of year. You can find it here. So, when you go through and look at this, California is A. It's your first one. Place is B. Face rhymes with place, so it's BB. That's in there. Then plenty of room at the Hotel California. That's an A. And then year and here are both C. So what you end up with is it's sort of like two couplets, but they're bound together with this other rhyme. So it's ADB, ACC, and it's going to go on like that. So that would be an example of a sestet. They're more complicated, and then you can get even more complicated with octaves. Octaves is the root word of oct, like octa, octopus, octogenarians. Eight. So octave is 8 lines that share a rhyme scheme, and there's tons of different combinations. The most famous octave was made by this guy named Petrarch from a city of Florence, and it's ABBA, ABBA, and all of his sonnets started out with this, and that's where the band ABBA. Now my dog is shaking the whole bed, scratching. That's where the band ABBA gets its name. Famous poem that's written with an octave is a poem by Wilfred Owen, who was a World War I poet. And he wrote this poem called Dulcet Decorum Est, which I think is the most powerful poem I've ever read if you read the whole thing. But he's writing about infantrymen in the First World War, British infantrymen. So, Dulcet Decorum Est by Wilfred Owen. Bent double like old beggars under sacks, knock-kneed, coughing like hags, we cursed through the sludge, till on the haunting flares we turned our backs, and toward our distant rest began to trudge. Men marched asleep, many had lost their boots, but limped on, bloodshot, all went lame, all blind, drunk with fatigue, deaf even to the hoots of gas shells dropping softly behind. So you can see this, pretty straightforward. Sacks is A. Sludge doesn't rhyme with sack, so it's B. Backs rhymes with sack, so it's A. Trudge rhymes with sludge, so it's B. Boots is new, that's a C. Blind is new, that's a D. Hoots goes with boots, it's a C. And behind goes with blind, it's a D. So it's sort of like a pair of quatrains, but they're all put together in a single stanza that has a consistent storyline behind it, and that makes it an octave. So it's an octave composed of two quatrains. I can talk. So anyway, now that we've gone over this, let's jump back over and take a look and see if we can identify the rhyme scheme here. I put it in a document so that I could do this. Let's tab over a little bit so that we can put them in here and have them all line up. I like lining them up. It's a little easier when you're doing it on paper instead of in a document. But stone is your first one, so it's going to be A. Lone definitely rhymes with stone, so that's also A. Shadows is new, that's B. Thereon, I got nothing there, that's a C. Swing, that's new too, that's a D. Imagining, I think rhythmic swing, my imagining. I don't think they rhyme. I think they're what's called a slant rhyme. So I'm going to have to call that one E. Shoulders is brand new, F. But gardening is E. So you do have some rhymes here. You have AA, and then you end it with E, F, E, and that F is, sort of separating those two. So this is how many lines? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. It's 8. So that makes it an octave. And that's the rhyme scheme. But let's see if we've got something similar going on here in the next one. Back is, what are we at, G? Doesn't go with anything up there, does it? And lack is G. Hey, that last one started with a couplet too. Me, that's brand new. H. Track goes with back. That's interesting. We got a G here. Leaf, that's new. A, B, C, D, F, G, H, I. I had to figure out where they... and grief goes with leaf, so we got an I. And discover, that's new, that's a J. But belief is I. And we're just going to do the whole poem. So we'll go down and take a look at the rest of this. And then we can figure out, the way that it rhymes and what's going on here. C. I feel like we had a me up there earlier, didn't we? Yeah, that was H. and there's nothing that rhymes with that. So we got an H here and an H. Unvision. That's not even a word, Hardy, but you know what? Poets can do what they want. That's a K. B, that goes back to me, so we got an H. Glade, that's L. Shade goes with that, though. That's L. Apparition, anything rhyme with apparition? I don't remember anything rhyme with apparition. Stone, moon, shadows thereon. Swing. Imagining. Shoulders. Nope. All right. HK. M. And then that's fade goes with shade. That's L. So the first stanza is a little rough in terms of its rhyme scheme, but the rest of them are pretty straightforward. It looks like G, G, H, G, I, I, J, I. H, H, K, H, L, L, M, L. I wonder if this one is supposed to rhyme in the same pattern. If that's the case, then it should be stone, lone. Thereon is rhyming with stone, their own. Maybe if you read it with a British accent. I'm not going to, but there it is. So there's your rhyme scheme. Now we're going to take a look at some sound devices, which will also help you out. One of the things poets do to make their poems memorable is write it in rhyme. They also give it a meter. I'm not going to burden you by making you learn meter and understand meter in ninth grade. It's complicated, and I struggle with it even now. But this one, I mean, you can tell it's in a meter because of the way, it's got a rhythm when you read it. I went by the druid stone that broods in the garden, white and lone, and I stopped and looked at the shifting shadows at some moments fall thereon from the tree hard by. So you can read it and put sort of a rhythm on it if you want to. And there's plenty of more rhythmic poems and maybe poems that have easier rhyme schemes that you can do. But I picked this one because of an Orpheus connection that you're going to see in just a second. So let's talk about sound devices. Alliteration. It's repetition of first consonant sounds. I gave you this example. Harris hates hamburgers. And I've already put some alliterations in this document for you to see and underline them. Actually, hold on one second. I'm going to go over all of the sound devices, and then I'm going to go over and look at them all in the poem. I think that's easier, and we don't have to jump back and forth so much. So alliteration is repetition of first consonant sounds. Harris hates hamburgers. Consonants is alliteration's the front end. Consonants is the back end. So we're looking at the other end of the poem, or the other end of the word. Take a look. Harris hates hamburgers, same phrase, but look at it. Harris hates hamburgers. So instead of focusing on the H sounds at the beginning, we're focusing on the S sounds at the end. So consonants is consonant sounds again, anything that's not a vowel sound, but we're looking at the ends of words. The problem is that English is a difficult language and hard to read without reading out loud. So sound devices depend, big surprise, on your ear and hearing the words as they are said. And English, the way words are spelled, does not necessarily translate directly to the way they are said. So, example, those fierce darts. Listen to it. Those fierce darts. Those three words have consonants. They are not spelled the same. S-E, that E is silent, so we end with an S sound. C-E makes an S sound, so it ends with an S sound. And darts ends with an S, and it's an S sound. So they all have consonants together, they're just spelled differently. So if you're just reading it on the page, if your teacher tells you to go read that poem, you may not see the consonants because it may not be there visibly, it's only there auditorially. And so I always suggest reading the poem out loud to yourself at least once before you try and interpret it. Next, we have what's called assonance. It's repetition of vowel sounds. A, E, I, O, and U, and sometimes Y. Depending on whether the Y makes a vowel sound or a consonant sound. Y is tricky that way. Why? I don't know. So repetition of vowel sounds. Again, my example, Harris hates hamburgers. Harris hates hamburgers. It's got the A sounds that are hard all the way through. Problem. English is a tricky language, and vowel sounds, even more so than other sounds, make multiple sounds. They make different sounds themselves. They make different sounds when in combination with other vowels. They make different sounds when it's like a Y, and you just have to magically know. So again, listen to it out loud and hear the sounds. The spelling is not going to clue you in. Good example, B. That's a hard E sound, like two E's. It's only spelled with one E, though. C, same sound, but it's EA. Happy, same sound, but it's a Y. Being, I before E except after C. Why isn't it underlining? Are those words both? All right, I'm going to check it out. Here's me having a spelling. So let's go back to the poem and look at what Hardy did here. What I did was I color coded it for you. I put, in fact, let me color code it in here, and maybe that'll make it a little easier for you. I put alliterations in blue, consonants in yellow, and assonants in green. So alliterations are going to be blue, consonants is going to be yellow, and assonance is going to be green. And I sort of highlighted it here for you in a way that hopefully you can start to see what's going on. So I went by the druid stone that broods in the garden white and lone, and I stopped and looked at the shifting shadows that at some moments fall thereon. From the tree hard by with a rhythmic swing, and they shaped in my imagining to the shade that a well-known head and shoulders threw there when she was gardening. Can you see all the literary devices? I and by both have a hard I sound. Garden and lone, they both end with an N sound, even though this E is here, it's silent. Look at all the D's in this line. And, stopped, and, looked. And then shifting shadows both have the sh sound at the beginning. That and at, it's sort of a rhyme, but they share consonants and assonants. That's what rhyme does generally. It shares all consonants and assonants after a different alliterative beginning sound or whatever you want to call it. And they shaped in my imagining. That's a bunch of I's. I, in, ing. It's the same sound. You have to say it out loud and kind of sounds silly. Head and shoulders. Oh, we could add shade. That's a D sound as well. So we've got more than I even saw before. Through there when she was gardening. So you can hear what he's doing with sound devices. I only did 2 stanzas because I thought it would be too much for me to do the whole thing. But let's look at the second stanza. I thought her behind my back. Yeah, her I long had learned to lack. Oops, I skipped that one. That I underlined it, but then I didn't blew it for you. I guess I blew it. And I said, I am sure you are standing behind me. Though how do you get into this old track? Can you hear it all? And there was no sound but the fall of a leaf as a sad response, and to keep down grief. I would not turn my head to discover that there was nothing in my belief. So you've got this strong series of, you see a lot of green, a lot of assonance here. I, behind, my, it's all the same I sound there. Behind and back are an alliteration. Long and learned and lack. I guess I turned that one blue instead of the other way around. But we have 3 L's there, and had and learned are D's, and then I, and behind, it's all the same I sound there. And sure and R, you wouldn't think those are R sounds because they have E's at the end, but the E's are silent, so they're R's, that's consonants. And do and you and to all have the same oo sound as a double O sound. And then in and is, it's the same I sound. It's not a hard I sound, it's the other sound I makes. Keep and grief spelled differently, but they have the same double E sound. And so these are things that you can identify in poems as well, and they're definitely in songs. So next time you listen to a song on the radio, see if you can identify the sound devices, the alliteration, consonants, and assonants, and that's kind of a cool thing that you can identify in poems. Next, you want to think about figurative language, similes, metaphors, conceits. So I guess we didn't go over conceits in this class. I'll take that one out because I'm not going to make you learn it. Oxymorons, paradoxes, hyperboles, personifications, apostrophes, all of these are great things to be looking for, and a number of them actually show up in this poem. Then don't forget, we still are going to be looking for symbols, allusions, allegories, and irony. So we've looked at sound devices. We've looked at the rhyme scheme. We've identified that this poem is written in octaves. It's got 8-line stanzas. We've looked at the rhyme scheme for those octaves. We've read it once, and you've heard me read it a couple of times. Next thing we should do, we should look at the title. We should look at the author. It's called The Shadow on the Stone, and that obviously happens in here. He's by the Druid stone that broods in the garden. That's personification, giving the stone human traits, like it's brooding. And I stopped and looked at the shifting shadows that at some moments fall thereon. So there's some shadows on the stone in his garden. So clearly the shadow on the stone is the subject of the poem itself. Let's make sure we understand it on a surface level. So this guy, whoever the narrator is, he's going by a druid stone. Well, hey, we should probably look up what a druid stone is because we don't know. So let's find out what a druid stone is. I think we're looking at Stonehenge or something like that. A druid's, hey, I was right. A druid stone is an achievement surrounding the story of the druids, blah, blah, blah. How about images? So apparently he has a stone in his garden that's called a druid stone. I guess it's sort of like the Celtic equivalent of a garden gnome or something like that. But he went by the druid stone that broods in the garden. That's personification, white and lone. And I stopped and looked at the shifting shadows that at some moments fall thereon. So apparently there's a tree that casts shadows on the stone and they sort of shift there. And it's called the shadow on the stone, so that's probably important. From the tree hard by with a rhythmic swing, and they shaped in my imagining to the shade that a well-known head and shoulders threw there when she was gardening. So apparently the shadow on the stone looks like the shade or the shadow that some woman, because we got she, we know that's the pronoun, who would usually be gardening there would have cast. I think it's also important that this she was somebody who was well known to Hardy. So like it's somebody that he knows really well, whose head and shoulders he's seen her shadow so many times that he knows what it looks like. Next stanza. I thought her behind my back. So he's standing looking at this, and it seems like whatever's casting the shadow is standing behind him. Yea, her I long had learned to lack. So this seems to imply that for whatever reason, this woman, this well-known woman, is gone. He had learned to lack her. He had learned to be without her. And I said, and so now he's talking to her and she's not there. That's an example of apostrophe, talking to something that cannot respond. So he says, I am sure you are standing behind me, though how do you get into this old track? And it's a question. It's a rhetorical question because there's going to be no answer. And there was no sound but the fall of a leaf. So there's no sound at all except for the tree that's casting the shadow drops a leaf on the ground as a sad response and to keep down grief. Now he's sad about the absence of this woman. Is she dead? Is she just gone? We don't really know at this point. I would not turn my head to discover. So to keep down grief, he doesn't turn his head to discover that there was nothing in his belief. He's believing that she's behind him. He's made belief in his head that she's standing behind him, but he doesn't turn back because he doesn't want to confirm to himself that she is in fact not there. So this is seeming more and more like a dead person, I think, that he wishes was still around and he wants to somehow believe that she's there with him. And that would make sense. The shadow on the stone. Stones are often headstones or grave markers. So maybe there's a connection between the idea of a stone, the druid stone, and a headstone or a grave or something like that. And then he concludes, yet I wanted to look and see that nobody stood at the back of me. So he wants to know for a fact that nobody's there. But I thought once more, nay, I'll not unvision a shape which somehow there may be. So I went on softly from the glade, and left her behind me throwing her shade. As she were indeed an apparition, my head unturned, unless, it's an old word for unless, my dream should fade. And so he doesn't look back because he wants to imagine that she's there, and he leaves without ever looking back to keep her alive to him in his mind. Okay, cool. So I suspect, as I imagine you do too, that we're talking about a woman that's well known to Hardy, that's no longer there. Is his wife dead? That's what I'm thinking. You know what you can do to verify that? You can go to this beautiful place called Wikipedia, and you can check him out. Let's move over because this guy's got a stunning mustache. Ooh, yeah, good stuff, Hardy. But let's take a look at his biography, early life, marriage and novel writing, poetry. How about marriage and novel writing? In 1870, while on an architectural mission to restore the parish church of St. Juliot in Cornwall, Hardy met and fell in love with Emma Gifford, whom he married. In 1855, Thomas and his wife moved to Maxgate, a house designed by Hardy and built by his brother. Although they later became estranged, Emma's subsequent death, oh, look at that, in 1912 had a traumatic effect on him, and after her death, Hardy made a trip to Cornwall to revisit places linked with their courtship. His poems, 1912 to 1913, reflect on her death. I bet The Shadow on the Stone is one of those. So then we're going to look at poems 1912 to 1913. Is there a list of poems? No, really? You're telling me you got this book called Poems and you don't give me a list of the poems? I bet it's one of them, though. I think we've got enough there to go on. So this poem is written about his dead wife. Okay, and we've got a symbol that maybe the stone itself represents a grave. That's cool. Let's look for an allusion, shall we? Anybody figure it out already? You may have figured it out already. I've dropped some hints. But hey, let's get back to our shadow on the stone. I went by the druid stone that broods in the garden. Broods is like to sit and think about something in a sad, pensive kind of a way, and that makes sense because that's what Hardy's doing here. He's brooding over the death of his wife. So that broods in the garden, white and alone. The druid stone, by the way, is alone, and so is Hardy. I'm starting to make the connections here. It's kind of exciting. And I stopped and looked at the shifting shadows that at some moments fall thereon. From the tree hard by with a rhythmic swing, there's a rhythm to this tree, and they shaped in my imagining to the shade. Hey, we use the word shade here for shadow. It's called the shadow on the stone. But why shade? Well, let's go back to ancient Greece, shall we? Rewind. What is a shade in ancient Greece? Oh, right. It's a dead person in the underworld. A shade that a well known head and shoulders threw there when she was gardening. So he's imagining, because of the shadow thrown from the tree on the stone in front of him, that his wife is standing behind him, but she's dead. Oh, wait. We've got a guy who's a poet. And we've got his wife behind him, and she's a shade. Da-da-da-da. You remember this guy, Orpheus? Yeah, Orpheus. He went down to get his wife Eurydice and bring her up, and the one rule from Hades to Orpheus was that he couldn't look back, and if he did, she would disappear, and he does, and she does. Spoiler, sorry. Okay, that's cool. So we are making a connection here with Orpheus. I thought her behind my back. This is his wife, his dead wife, just like Orpheus wanted to get his dead wife. Hardy's dead wife, I should say, in this case. Yea, her I long had learned to lack. So he had learned, against his will, how to deal with her not being there, but he's suddenly imagining that she's there. And I said, and so he talks to her, I am sure you are standing behind me, though how do you get into this old track? How'd you come back to the real world? How'd you come back to be here with me? And there was no sound but the fall of a leaf as a sad response, and to keep down grief, I would not turn my head to discover that there was nothing in my belief. So this is a allusion to the Orpheus myth, but it's a key reversal. In the Orpheus myth, Orpheus couldn't look back. If he looked back, it would destroy his wife, and she would go back to Hades. In this case, Hardy doesn't want to look back because if he looks back, She'll no longer, I guess it's similar. She'll no longer exist. In his mind, he can imagine that she exists because he hasn't looked back. But if he looks back, he finds out she's not there and she's gone. So he can pretend, at least in memory, that she's there. Yet I wanted to look and see, this is something that Orpheus dealt with, that nobody stood at the back of me, but I thought once more, nay, I'll not unvision a shape which somehow there may be. So I went on softly from the glade, and left her behind me throwing her shade. As she were indeed an apparition, my head unturned, lest my dream should fade. The difference between Hardy and Orpheus is Hardy doesn't look back. He walks out, he keeps her alive by not looking back. That's what Orpheus couldn't do. Interesting. So that's the poem. We've read it a lot of times, but that's what you need to do. You can't be assigned a poem by a teacher and say, hey, I'm going to read it once and magically understand it. You're not going to magically understand it. You got to wrestle with it. You got to struggle with it. You got to try and identify these things. And in the process of identifying these things, you read it enough times that you start to see other things. And then you go look those other things up, like, hey, what is a druid stone? And hey, let's take a look at Hardy's bio and figure out what he's all about. And, let's look up this word that I don't know. And let's do the rhyme scheme and let's do the sound devices and let's identify some symbols. And are there any metaphors or similes? Are there any metaphors or similes? Let's find out. Similes are easy to find. Like. There's no like. How about as? As if she were indeed an apparition. And as a sad response, a leaf falling from the tree. So we have a couple of similes in there. But you look for all these things and you try and identify them. And as you try and identify them, the poem comes clear in your mind, and then you understand what's going on. So let's take a look at it without all the garbage that I put in there, and just read it one more time and appreciate the poem for what it is. The Shadow on the Stone by Thomas Hardy. I went by the druid stone that broods in the garden white and lone, and I stopped and looked at the shifting shadows that at some moments fall thereon from the tree hard by where the rhythmic swing, and they shaped, in my imagining, to the shade that a well-known head and shoulders threw there when she was gardening. I thought her behind my back, yes, her I long had learned to lack, and I said, I am sure you're standing behind me, though how do you get into this old track? And there was no sound but the fall of a leaf as a sad response, and to keep down grief, I would not turn my head to discover that there was nothing in my belief. Yet I wanted to look and see that nobody stood at the back of me, but I thought once more, nay, I'll not unvision a shape which somehow there may be. So I went on softly from the glade, and I left her behind me, throwing her shade, as she were indeed an apparition, my head unturned, lest my dream should fade. Great poem. All right, I'm going to stop this. If you have questions, you have comments, leave them for me. Let me know. And we're going to do some work with another Thomas Hardy poem for the rest of the class. Thanks.